The first time I saw the $500 fine sitting on my front porch, I honestly thought it was a joke. I looked at that little white envelope stuck under my frozen doormat, looked back at the mountain of snow covering my driveway, and I remember laughing because I couldn't believe someone had actually decided this was the most important problem in our neighborhood. But that laugh disappeared pretty quickly when I opened the envelope and realized the people who wrote it weren't joking at all. They were serious. They wanted my money, and they claimed I had broken a rule that, as far as I knew, had never existed. My name is Daniel Harper, and for most of my life I was the kind of person who avoided conflict whenever possible. I worked with my hands. I fixed old furniture. I spent weekends repairing things around my house. And I always believed that being a good neighbor meant keeping your head down, treating people with respect, and not making unnecessary enemies. I never imagined I would end up in a fight against my own homeowners association over a pile of snow. But sometimes the smallest battles reveal the biggest problems hiding underneath. It happened during one of the harshest winters our little community of Pine Hollow Estates had seen in years. A storm rolled in overnight and dumped nearly a foot of heavy, wet snow across the entire area. The kind of snow that doesn't just sit there looking pretty, it sticks to everything, weighs down tree branches, turns sidewalks into frozen concrete, and makes every person on the street look like they are preparing for an expedition to the North Pole. By sunrise, the neighborhood was alive. Snowblowers were roaring. Shovels were scraping against pavement, and everyone was outside bundled up in thick jackets and gloves trying to dig themselves out. I was halfway through clearing the path from my garage to the street when I noticed something strange. My neighbor across the road, Linda Brooks, was standing near my mailbox staring at my front door. She had that look people get when they know something happened, but don't want to be the first one to say it. I walked over and asked, "Everything okay?" She pointed toward my porch and said, "You might want to check what they left you." I walked back, brushed the snow off the envelope, and opened it right there in the freezing air. Inside was a violation notice from the Pine Hollow Community Association. The charge was simple: failure to clear the public walkway before 7 a.m. The penalty, $500. I checked my phone. It was 9:47 in the morning. For a second, I thought maybe I had missed some emergency announcement. Maybe there was a city rule I didn't know about. Maybe I had overlooked something in the HOA handbook. So I went inside, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and pulled out the thick rule book they had mailed to every homeowner the previous summer. I started reading through the winter maintenance sections slowly, line by line. The rule said homeowners were responsible for keeping walkways safe and accessible during winter weather. That was it. No 7 a.m. deadline. No specific hour. No mention that a homeowner could be fined because they were still shoveling snow after sunrise. I remember sitting there holding that booklet and feeling something change. At first, I was annoyed about the money. Anyone would be. But after a while, the money wasn't the thing bothering me anymore. It was the feeling that someone had decided they could simply add a rule, enforce it, and expect everyone else to quietly accept it. I sent a polite email to the HOA board asking them to show me where the 7 a.m. requirement was written in the official governing documents. I wasn't trying to start a war. I just wanted an answer. A few hours later, I received a reply from the HOA president, a man named Charles Whitmore. Charles had always been the kind of person who enjoyed reminding everyone that he was in charge. He wasn't rude exactly, but he carried himself like every conversation was a meeting and every neighbor was an employee waiting for instructions. Attached to his email was a screenshot of the rule. He wrote, "As you can see, the requirement is clearly established." But when I looked closer, something felt wrong. The wording looked different from the rest of the document. The font was slightly thinner. The spacing didn't match. It looked like someone had taken a sentence from somewhere else and inserted it into the page. Most people probably would have ignored that feeling. They would have paid the fine, complained for a few days, and moved on. But I had spent years restoring old houses, and one thing I learned from that work is that small cracks usually point to bigger damage underneath. So I started looking. I searched through archived community documents, old meeting notes, and public records, and within a few hours, I found something that made my stomach drop. The rule Charles was using against me wasn't in the older version of the HOA handbook, not even close. And that was the moment I realized this was never really about snow. I spent the next few days doing something I never thought I would have to do as a homeowner. I started investigating my own neighborhood association. And honestly, at the beginning, I felt a little ridiculous. I would sit at my kitchen table after dinner with a laptop open, stacks of printed documents around me, and I would ask myself, Daniel, are you really spending your evenings looking through HOA paperwork because of a snow fine? But every time I thought about letting it go, I remembered that little change in the document, that one sentence that appeared out of nowhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. The more I looked, the more questions I had. I found an older version of the Pine Hollow Estates Community Handbook stored in the County Archive website. It was dated less than a year before the new version Charles Whitmore had sent me. The winter maintenance section was almost identical except for one very important detail. There was no 7 a.m. deadline, no required inspection time, no automatic violation, nothing. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a confusing interpretation. Someone had added that language later. I immediately emailed the HOA board again, this time asking for the official amendment records, the meeting minutes, and the approval history showing when that rule had been adopted. I expected them to say they would look into it. I expected maybe a delayed response, or some excuse about needing time to gather documents. What I got instead was a 2-sentence reply from Charles. The association's internal administrative records are not available for individual review. The matter is closed. That response bothered me more than the fine itself, because when someone tells you something is none of your business, especially when it involves your own money and your own rights, it usually means there is something they don't want you to see. So I did what most people would probably avoid. I contacted an attorney. Her name was Rebecca Miles, and she specialized in property disputes in HOA law. When I brought her the documents, she didn't immediately react the way I expected. She didn't slam the papers down and say, "This is outrageous." Instead, she quietly flipped through them, compared the dates, checked the signatures, and after about 20 minutes, she looked up at me and said, "Daniel, I don't think your problem is the snow." I asked her what she meant. She tapped the page with the added rule and said, "Your problem is whether this association had the authority to create this rule at all." That was the first time I realized this could go beyond one unfair fine. Rebecca explained that under our state's community association regulations, HOAs were required to maintain transparent records of any changes made to governing documents. If they added a new restriction, especially one connected to financial penalties, there had to be a documented process. There had to be approval. There had to be a record. And in many cases, those changes had to be filed with the county within a specific period. She sent a formal request to the HOA demanding the amendment history. 3 days later, something interesting happened. The same people who told me those records were internal information suddenly found a way to provide them. And when we received the files, everything started falling apart. The timeline was almost impossible to ignore. The 7 a.m. snow removal requirement had been added only 3 months before my fine. There was no homeowner vote recorded, no meeting where residents approve it, no public notice sent to the community. And the biggest problem of all, the amendment had never been properly filed with the county. According to Rebecca, that meant the rule had never officially become enforceable. But then we found something that changed the entire situation. Buried in the financial records was a contract approved around the same time the snow rule appeared. The HOA had hired a snow removal company called Frostline Services. At first glance, that didn't seem unusual. Large communities hire snow contractors all the time. But when Rebecca looked closer at the ownership information, she found something interesting. Frostline Services was owned by Mark Whitmore, Charles's cousin. Suddenly, the pieces started connecting. The person who created the stricter snow rule was the same person who approved a contract benefiting a company owned by a family member. And the timing was not random. The new rule created a situation where homeowners who couldn't clear snow by the new deadline could be fined, and many of those homeowners were then encouraged to hire the company that Charles's cousin owned. It was a perfect circle. The HOA created the pressure, the company benefited from that pressure, and the people paying the price were the homeowners who trusted the system. When I told my neighbors what I found, the reaction was immediate. Some people were angry. Some were embarrassed. Some admitted they had already paid fines because they thought fighting the HOA wasn't worth the trouble. Linda Brooks, the neighbor who first warned me about the envelope on my door, told me she had paid 2 winter violations the previous month because she was taking care of her elderly mother and couldn't get outside before sunrise every morning. She looked at me and said, "I thought I was just bad at following the rules. I never thought the rules themselves could be fake." That sentence stayed with me because that was the real damage. It wasn't just the money. It was the trust. A community association only works when people believe the people running it are acting in good faith. Without that, it becomes nothing more than a group with authority and no accountability. We decided to challenge the fines officially. Rebecca prepared everything: the emails, the document versions, the amendment records, the payment history, and the contract information. Charles, meanwhile, seemed completely confident. He continued telling residents that everything was being handled and that the accusations were misunderstandings from a disgruntled homeowner. But I noticed something different whenever he spoke now. The confidence was still there, but underneath it was something else: nervousness. He knew the paperwork was no longer on his side. A few weeks later, we received the hearing date, and that was when I realized this small fight over a patch of snow-covered sidewalk had turned into something much bigger. It was no longer about whether I should have shoveled before 7 a.m. It was about whether someone in power could rewrite the rules, benefit from them personally, and expect everyone else to stay quiet. The morning of the hearing, I woke up before my alarm even went off. I remember lying there for a few minutes staring at the ceiling, thinking about how strange life can be. A few months earlier, my biggest concern had been whether I could clear enough snow from my driveway before heading to work. I never imagined that a single envelope on my front door would lead me into a fight with my own homeowners association, force me to dig through public records, hire an attorney, and sit across from the person who had spent years convincing everyone that he was untouchable. But there I was. And the funny thing was, I wasn't even angry anymore. The anger had faded. What I felt instead was something much quieter: determination. Because by that point, I understood this wasn't about winning an argument. It was about making sure people knew they had the right to question things when something didn't feel right. The hearing took place in a small community meeting room at the county administration building. It wasn't some dramatic courtroom with cameras and a judge walking in wearing a black robe. There were no movie moments, no speeches, no grand entrance. Just a plain room with old chairs, a long wooden table, a stack of documents, and a group of homeowners sitting silently, waiting to see if the truth was actually going to matter. I looked around and recognized almost everyone there. Some of them were neighbors I had known for years, people I had waved to while checking the mail, people I had helped carry groceries inside during storms. And now we were all sitting in the same room because a group of people in power had decided that a rule could exist simply because they said it did. Then Charles Whitmore walked in. He arrived about 10 minutes early, wearing a perfectly pressed navy suit and carrying a leather folder that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom. He had the same confident expression he always wore at HOA meetings, that calm little smile that made it seem like every question had already been answered before anyone asked it. He shook hands with a few residents, nodded politely, and sat down across from us. For a moment, I saw the old Charles, the man who used to stand at community meetings and tell everyone that the HOA was protecting property values and maintaining standards. The man who always spoke with absolute certainty, but this time was different. This time, he wasn't standing in front of a room full of people who assumed he knew what he was doing. This time, he was sitting across from documents that told a different story. Rebecca Miles, my attorney, sat beside me. She was calm, organized, and honestly, probably the least emotional person in that room. I remember asking her before we started, "Are you nervous?" She smiled and said, "No, paperwork doesn't get nervous, Daniel. It just tells the truth." That sentence stayed with me because that was exactly what we had. Not rumors, not accusations, not personal attacks, just records. The hearing began with Charles explaining his side. He spoke smoothly, almost rehearsed. He said the HOA had created the snow deadline because residents needed clear walkways for safety. He said winter conditions required stronger enforcement. He said the association had acted responsibly and that my challenge was based on a misunderstanding of the rules. Listening to him, I noticed something. He kept talking about why the rule was a good idea, but he never explained the one thing everyone wanted to know. Who approved it? Rebecca waited until he finished. Then she slowly opened her folder. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "before we discuss whether the rule was a good idea, we need to discuss whether the rule legally existed." The room went quiet. She placed the original handbook on the table. This was the official winter policy before the change. Then she placed the newer version beside it, and this is the document used to issue fines. She pointed to the added sentence requiring homeowners to clear sidewalks before 7 a.m. "Can you show us the meeting minutes where this amendment was approved?" Charles looked down at his papers. He flipped through a few pages, but he didn't find what he was looking for. Becca asked again, "Can you show us the homeowner vote?" Another pause. "Can you show us the notice sent to residents informing them of this change?" Still nothing. The confident man who had once spoken over entire meetings was suddenly searching through silence. Then Rebecca presented the county records. The amendment had never been properly filed. Without that filing, the rule could not legally be enforced the way the HOA had used it. I watched some of the homeowners exchange looks. You could almost feel the realization spreading across the room. They weren't just hearing that one fine was wrong. They were realizing every person who had paid those fines might have been punished under a rule that never should have existed. Then came the part that changed everything. Rebecca placed the snow removal contract on the table. "Now we need to discuss the timing of this amendment," she said. She explained that the new 7 a.m. requirement appeared only weeks before the HOA approved a contract with Frostline Services, a company owned by Charles Whitmore's cousin. Suddenly, the room felt different. Up until that moment, Charles had been defending a policy. Now he had to defend a connection. The hearing officer looked directly at him. "Were you involved in approving this contract?" Charles answered yes. "Did you disclose your relationship with the contractor to homeowners?" He hesitated. "I don't believe that was necessary." That answer created a reaction around the room. Not shouting, not chaos. Just that uncomfortable silence people make when they hear something they know doesn't sound right. Because sometimes the most revealing moments aren't dramatic. Sometimes they're just one sentence from someone who believes they haven't done anything wrong. Rebecca continued laying out the timeline. The rule appeared. The fines began. The snow contract was approved. Homeowners were pressured to either wake up before sunrise every morning or risk penalties. And if they couldn't keep up, they were directed toward a company financially connected to the person enforcing the rule. By the end of her presentation, there wasn't much left to argue. The facts had created their own story. The hearing officer reviewed the documents carefully, asked a few final questions, and then delivered the decision. The 7 a.m. requirement was invalid. All fines issued under that rule were dismissed. Every homeowner who had paid penalties would receive a refund. The total amount returned to the community came to more than $42,000. But the financial loss was only one part of the consequence. The matter was also referred to the State Regulatory Board for review of possible financial misconduct. Charles left the room without the confidence he had walked in with. He didn't say much. He didn't make another speech about protecting the neighborhood. He simply gathered his papers and walked out. And honestly, watching him leave was a strange feeling. I didn't feel like I had defeated him. I felt like the truth had finally caught up with him. Over the next several months, Pine Hollow Estates changed. Charles resigned from the HOA board. The contract with Frostline Services was canceled. New board members were elected, and the association began reviewing every policy they had created during the previous years. But the biggest change wasn't something you could write down in a document. It was the way people started paying attention. Residents who never attended meetings before started showing up. People began reading the rules instead of just accepting whatever they were told. Neighbors who had spent years saying, "That's just how the HOA works," started asking, "Is that actually allowed?" And maybe that was the most important thing that came from all of this. Not the refund, not Charles stepping down, not even proving that the rule was wrong. The biggest victory was reminding people that communities only work when everyone involved respects the same standards. Rules matter, structure matters, but accountability matters too, because without accountability, even a good system can be turned into something harmful. Looking back now, I still think about that first morning when I found that envelope on my porch. A simple snow violation, a $500 fine, something most people would have paid and forgotten. And maybe that's exactly what Charles expected. Maybe he expected everyone to be too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to question him. But sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "Hold on, show me where that rule came from." One question can uncover an entire system. One person can remind a whole community that their voice still matters. So I want to ask you something. If you received a fine for breaking a rule that you believed was never properly created, would you fight it, or would you just pay it and move on? Do you think people in positions of authority should face stronger consequences when they misuse that power? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because I know this is one of those situations where people see things differently. Some believe rules should always be followed without question. Others believe every rule deserves to be challenged if it was created unfairly. I'd love to hear where you stand. And if this story reminded you of something happening in your own community, share it. Because sometimes the smallest disagreements, a parking space, a fence line, a snow-covered sidewalk, can reveal much bigger questions about fairness, trust, and who really has the right to decide what happens around us.